I think the thing that made it all the more exciting for us was the absolute illegality of everything. There was definitely an all-pervasive air of danger that accompanied all of this, and that led itself to a bit of excitement, to be honest.
I'm Kay Anderson, and you are listening to Lost Spaces, a podcast that mourns the death of queer nightlife. Every episode, I talk to a different person about a venue from their past, the memories they created there, and the people that they used to know. Kurt Luthy began working in the music industry as a nightclub and radio DJ in 1987, and since then has worn many hats, including artist management and executive producing. We talked about Terminus, a nightclub that opened in Brisbane, Australia in 1981, and which Kurt started going to as a fresh-faced 17-year-old in 1985.
I grew up in a regional town called Rockhampton, and as is the way, high school finishes on a Friday, and I finished my senior year on a Friday, and I was booked on the first flight out on Monday. And, this was a prearranged deal that my mother had made with me. As long as I finished school, I could leave straight away. So I did, and I did that mainly because, obviously, I wanted to be involved in a more metropolitan type scenario. And Brisbane was the obvious stepping stone because even though it was probably one of the lesser cosmopolitan capitals in the country, it was still a capital city in my own state that I was familiar with. So I moved to Brisbane and very quickly found myself going to the Terminus, which was probably one of three very well patronised and very popular gay nightclubs in the mid-'80s, early to mid-'80s in Brisbane, all of which were pretty much centred around Fortitude Valley, which by way of comparison, and I know you're in London, it would almost be offensive for me to compare it to, because it's not Soho. But I guess it was Fortitude Valley was Brisbane's red light district. It was also an area that was rife with corruption, and this was one of the things that always fascinated me and drew me to the area, even just as much as a gay nightclub where I could go and dance and wear makeup, which we all did, and have outrageously high hair and all that sort of stuff. It was also centred firmly in the midst of some of the most vice-ridden streets known to the country, actually, and the government of the day, as it famously was exposed, was one of the most corrupt in any democracy in the world, whereby the police and the police commissioner and several high-ranking members of the government were all on the take. And so, of course, everything in the 80s in Queensland was illegal. Homosexuality was definitely illegal.
Wow.
Yeah, and so when I was late teens, 17 was when I first started going to the Terminus, and of course I was underage. We were all underage. Homosexuality was illegal. Gay nightclubs were pretty much, not meant to be. Prostitution was certainly illegal. Gambling was illegal. The great irony being that the true powers that be were making a huge amount of money out of prostitution, out of gambling, and even out of the queer gay nightclubs, because to save yourself from being raided every other night, you would pay off the Queensland police. And this was a well-known thing. Everybody had their own deal. Everybody had their own rate. And they would still come and raid the gay nightclubs in particular, just to give the public the impression that they were, being very heavy on deviance. And this was another thing that was introduced when when we were all frequenting the Terminus, the passing of legislation, an act called the Deviant Act, whereby publicans, so anybody behind a bar who was the licensee, was endowed with the right to refuse service based on one's appearance. If they deemed that you looked like a deviant, then they could not serve you, and furthermore could call the police. So this was the climate.
And so was there any type of explanation of what they meant by deviant?
Absolutely. It was very arbitrary. They would give vague recommendations of vague criteria. For example, if you were wearing all black before 5 p.m, that would probably constitute you as being a deviant.
Or having just been to a funeral.
Oh, for sure. If you were clearly gay, that would be classed as a deviant. Obviously, we're talking mid-80s, so gender bender was in full flight and still highly popular, and that was de rigueur amongst my peer group. Everybody was either not necessarily cross-dressing, but certainly being quite flamboyant and what have you, and all the guys I knew, we all wore makeup. None of us were doing drag. It was just this was how we rolled.
A kind of new romantic punky type thing.
Far more that, yes. So clearly we were deviants, and this would manifest itself with police stopping us on the street in the middle of the day. I shit you not, making us empty our bags, empty our pockets. We'd pretty much be made a spectacle of in broad daylight. You became very used to it. And like I say, I wouldn't swap it for the world, because it showed me bad things can go under a so-called democracy and how corrupt things can get. And it has definitely helped mould my outlook on a so-called democracy and my political views to this day.
So we've got a good idea of what Queensland, Brisbane were like in the 80s. What did that mean for you? Who were you at that point in time?
I'd organised to stay with a friend whom I'd met via the Queensland Theatre Company, because my friends and I had become very involved in theatre. And look, we're ticking all the cliche boxes here. Young gay guy involved in theatre. And so I'd organised that I could live with him and his mother. He went on to... He was a straight guy, but just a tremendously good person. And he went on to become a bit of a name in television acting. And so it was the intention, and it was always expected that I would audition for various acting schools in Queensland, or possibly even NIDA. But when I arrived in Brisbane and started frequenting the Terminus, that had a huge impact on me, whereby I pretty much abandoned any notion of wanting to go and indenture myself to another course or any form of study. And I really just wanted to spend my nights out clubbing. And that is essentially what I ended up doing for the better part of the next year. And back in those days, things were cheap. Life was cheap. You could smuggle a cask of wine into a venue so that you didn't have to pay for any drinks and stuff. Of course, it was horrendous, and you'd inevitably throw up on yourself. But that's pretty much what I ended up doing, was just involving myself heavily in nightlife.
So let's get on to the Terminus. Can you help kind of give an idea of what the venue was like physically?
Sure. It was, look, I loved it. And I think it also helped instill in me a love of subterranean venues, because you would have to descend down a decent set of stairs. It was certainly going into a basement level. And it was a relatively small club. I think the capacity would have been maybe 300. So it really was intimate. It wasn't very wide. It was longer than it was, wide. And it was it had a back exit that led out into a car park, which was highly advantageous because as soon as the raids were
somewhere to go.
Yeah. So, security would automatically grab all of us that were clearly underage and herd us out the back door, and we would essentially just scramble and scatter, so that it was difficult for anybody to, grab a hold of you, and out into a car park / laneway. So that was the physicality of the place. Like I said, it was small, it was intimate, it was Queensland, so it was always hot, even with air conditioning. It was hot. And the beauty of it was that it didn't take much in terms of patronage to make it feel busy.
Do you remember your first time?
I vividly. I went down. I was quite nervous because this is my first outing to a gay nightclub, actually, and I was all of 17. And, I was concerned that maybe I wouldn't even get in. But then, of course, as soon as I started to descend down to the venue and queue, and I could see that I was, by no means the only underage person there. So I thought, okay, I'm in with a chance. Nobody even asked for ID. It was just like, you paid your cover charge, which I think may have been $1, and you wandered on in. And I think it was a Friday night, so the place was heaving. And it was like, I was a kid in a candy store. There were hundreds of other people that were into the same sort of thing that I was into. On that first night, I saw my very first drag show, which was some really quite fucking horrible drag queens doing the Eurythmics and Aretha Franklin sisters are doing it for themselves, which at the time was a hit. So I mean, it was current at least, but that was the first thing, one of the first things I saw upon being down there, and sort of being a bit blown away. It was just like, right, okay, here we are,
And so who were you with on that first night?
Look, I was with one of my best friends, Juliana, who remains one of my best friends, and she had fled Rockhampton several months prior to me, so I teamed up with her as soon as I was able to. So we went down there, and to be honest, that's I am gregarious by nature, so I had no problem in talking to whoever, and because I was legitimately intrigued and enthralled by the various characters that were there. So I kind of made friends very quickly, and some of them I still have today, because we're all pretty poor. We're on the dole. I think we used to get $50 a week, I think, is what we got. So you would typically rock up with a cask of horrible wine, and the big drug of the day, apart from obviously, say marijuana or amphetamines, and this pretty much predated ecstasy making its way into the scene as well. So we were always after a cheap buzz, which usually would be a diet pill called MediSlim, which was amped up in pseudoephedrine. So you would neck several of those and down that with, large Hungry Jack's cups of Frugalexia.
Sorry, I just need to say Hungry Jack's, for anyone who doesn't know, is Burger King in Australia. That's the name.
Absolutely.
That it goes by. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I just haven't heard that in a long time.
Yeah. But at that stage too, I was highly inactive sexually. It didn't even cross my mind, to be honest, even though I was in a room full of gays and lesbians. Sort of getting off was one of the last things I even contemplated, because I guess I was so into music and I was so into dancing that was the highlight for me. That was the appeal and that was the attraction, and that's what I really pursued when going there. Get sideways on cheap over-the-counter pharmaceuticals and dance.
And if we could go back in time,
mm-hmm.
for one night, and we went to the Terminus together, what would be the drink of choice?
It would be Strongbow cider.
Strongbow cider. What songs would we request from the DJ?
Oh, this is good. It's tricky. There was a lot of high energy, as I say, There would be a few that were very popular. That would be Eartha Kitt, I Need a Man. One of the ones that I often requested. And I will say, I mean, I think it's probably poignant to share the fact that I went on to become a nightclub DJ for several decades and still work in the music industry. So as such, I was always so obsessed with music, and I was one of those guys that the DJ probably really disliked, because I'd be like, oh, can you please play this? And so another one that I would often request would be Nina Hagen's New York, New York. Do you know that one?
Yes, yeah.
Ah, fantastic. Such a great song. And then there were a few classic high-energy songs by people like Hazel Dean. And there was another one by a group called Lime called On the Grid. These probably mean absolutely nothing to you. But they're the sorts of things. Oh, and one more that sort of was one of those crossover hits that was hugely popular that I still love today is the Bee Gees penned Chain Reaction for Diana Ross.
Yeah.
Yes.
So if we're talking about a typical night, what happens in the lead up to going out?
So it would be several of us congregating at somebody's house, preferably the closer to the venue, the better, because you would be drinking cheap, nasty liquor and probably necking a couple of the aforementioned Medi Slim. And you'd play whatever music you could. I mean, this was a tricky one too because there wasn't much money to go around. Once again, there wasn't the internet, so you couldn't just YouTube something or Spotify something. You'd have to hopefully congregate at somebody's house that had a good mixtape would be a great thing, and hang around the mirror, doing each other's makeup and hair and trying on clothes. Like it really was about the look, and hours would be spent in getting ready to go to the club.
And so talk to me about the makeup and the hair. What would your typical look be?
I like to keep the makeup relatively natural. So I would have a relatively autumnal palette, light browns, things like that, in terms of eyeshadow and stuff. Always a darker eyeliner. Because I was always really fair anyways. I still am. So, going too heavy in dark colours, I wasn't a goth. I wasn't about to make up like one. The hairspray of choice was one called Final Net. I don't even know if it's on the market anymore. It probably isn't. And you would backcomb the fuck out of your hair. Like you would have a really long fringe and you would backcomb that so that it pretty much was anti-gravity and sat upright. Black mascara, black eyeliner. Foundation, of course, because, we were 17. We were zitty kids. You had to have foundation. Once again, there was no money, but there were some highly skilled shoplifters. So, we always had a decent range of makeup, The girls would just go and flog it.
So we've talked about your hair, we've talked about your makeup. What's the typical thing you'd be wearing on the night out?
Oh, God. Let's see. Pointy shoes were always very big, and I had several pair of those. I don't know how I afforded these things. I think there were op shops as well that I purchased a fair bit from. You would have a lot of... it was pretty varied actually. There was a lot of costume jewelry. I mean, I didn't wear that so much. I might wear the odd... it's camp. I might wear the odd diamante brooch. Look, everybody was always wearing everybody else's clothes. That was one of the other things that I remembered. So, it was rare that you would wear anything as casual as T-shirt and jeans. Like I never did. We never wore that. There was always a costume of sorts. And I think you pretty much succinctly hit on it when you mentioned New Romantics earlier, So there were a lot of, say, white frilly shirts, jackets with brocade on it, a slightly military look, something akin to an Adam and the Ants, something akin to an early Spandau ballet. For the more adventurous and those with a bit more money, there would be certainly hair extensions would be big and more that sort of the obvious reference is George O'Dowd, Boy George. People would do that look. I tended to stick mainly with a, sort of a new romantic look, I guess. Yeah.
Suddenly the lights are up, we're going home, or we're getting kicked out of the club. Where's the next stop? What do we do next?
Well, typically, what would, 9 times out of 10, because curiously enough, despite the fact that there was, a very heavy-handed police presence in Brisbane at the time, well, in Queensland at the time, they had amazingly generous licensing laws whereby clubs didn't have to close until 5. So the Terminus would always close at 3, and it had a license until then. And then about 2 blocks away was a club that still exists in Brisbane, is still hugely popular. It is nowhere near as queer as it used to be. In fact, it is pretty much the domain of heterosexual clubbing, but a nightclub called The Beat. And that would be open until 5. And once again, for whatever reason, these venues were free or very, very cheap to get into. And so we would typically, en masse, march up a block and go to The Beat and stay there until 5.
So you talked about your first year in Brisbane being clubbing, going out and having a good time. What happened after that year?
Well, after that year, funnily enough, after a night at the Terminus, I was living in a suburb called Spring Hill, which is one suburb away from the valley. So it was just a walk to the club and back. And I was living with a young British guy who was heterosexual, and but he loved coming to party with us. And he came to party with us one night, and he met this girl at the club, and she was up from Sydney. And they hit it off, and I think clearly they had a good time that night. And she went back to Sydney the next day. Now, he was clearly struck by her. And when we woke up the next morning, he said, I'm going to jump on a bus and go to Sydney. Do you want to come? And I thought, well, why not? I've got nothing here. I don't have a job. I don't have anything. And ironically, it was the week that I'd turned 18. So that entitled me to a bigger doll payment. I think it jumped from $50 a week to maybe $100 a week. And so, I was feeling flush. It was just like, wow, I've got all this money. So I jumped on a bus with him and I went to Sydney. This obviously is before mobile telephones, internet, any of that. All we had to go on was that this girl was living in Darlinghurst on this particular street. And my friend tracked her down, and I found myself in Sydney.
Did you ever go back?
I did indeed. I did. And look, things were kind of changing a lot by the time I did go back. There were shifts going on in the government and in the police force and all that sort of stuff, which and movement for the better. But it was becoming quite obvious that the Terminus was probably about to run its course. It was there were competing nightclubs opening up. And of course, like anything, it has a life cycle. And so by, say, 87, it was well and truly, in my eyes, on the wane, which was a bit of a shame because it holds, a very nostalgic place for me, even after a year after. So yeah, I mean, these days I think it could be a titty bar. I'm not too sure, but it's certainly nothing like it was. So yeah, I went back, but it just didn't even feel the same. And to be fair, music was changing, and once again, music was always my focus. Music was changing, and the DJs at the Terminus weren't progressing with music, By this time, we were starting to head into the realm of house and all that sort of stuff. And the Terminus was, for my money, was still stuck in a high-energy loop. So, it was a very brief passage in history for me, but certainly one of the most influential for me.
How did that club shape you? It was your first gay club. It was the first time you were around non-heterosexuals.
Yeah. It liberated me. It allowed me to be me without any sense of censorship, because once you were down in amongst those four walls, all bets were off. It was pretty much unbridled. You could be and say and do whatever you wanted, It was truly small L liberal, and surprisingly, as bitchy as any gay scene can be, as bitchy as any scene can be, surprisingly, people were very accommodating, and they weren't there to dump on you and stuff. And I think that was because, outside of those four walls, we all had bigger battles to fight. And so there was a definite sense of solidarity and comradeship, down there. And that's what really struck me was the license to be oneself and to express yourself as quaint and as trite as that may sound, and I think certainly personified the gay scene in the mid-'80s in Brisbane. It was without doubt the most popular nightclub at the time.
Did you ever go to the Terminus? Do you have your own stories or photos that you want to share, preferably with lots of eyeliner on? Let's connect on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and other places under the username KAndersonMusic. Lost Spaces is not only a podcast, but is also a concept record. I've been writing songs about queer spaces and the people who lived their lives there, and we'll be releasing those songs periodically over the next year. You can hear the first single from the set, Well Grown Boys, which is also the theme song for this episode, available to stream on iTunes and Spotify and other places, and you might even want to buy it if you can. If you liked today's episode and you want to hear more, it would make a huge difference if you subscribed. And then on top of that, if you left a review or told your friends or posted something on social media, I would be your best friend forever. My name is Kay Anderson, and you've been listening to Lost Spaces.